Welcome to the first installment of a new class that we are doing on the book of Proverbs. It is a Wednesday only class. Steve is going to be teaching as we gather in person on Sundays the book of Philippians. But for this Proverbs class taking place every Wednesday, I am going to try to record these classes ahead of time each week, and they will premiere at 7:30, our normal Bible class time, each Wednesday. These classes will also be a little bit shorter than our typical 45-minute or so class period. And one of the reasons that we'll be doing that is because there may be some of you that are with other people, whether with your families at home or with maybe another family or two, or people that you have gathered together with to participate in this class together. And so one of the things I hope to do is to end each class with a point or two or a question or two that could lead to further discussion. And so the hope, the encouragement is that if we are gathered with other people, we might take a few minutes at the end of the video to discuss some of these things that are being proposed. The material for this class has been emailed out to members and will be available on our website, belairchurchofchrist.org, under Bible class materials. I cannot take credit for this material and even the PowerPoint that we'll be using. This was all created originally by my dad and by my older brother who taught this class together in Atlanta. I've adapted it for our purposes, and that's where a lot of this comes from. So with nothing else to be said, let's jump into our discussion of the book of Proverbs. You have a schedule on the front page of your handout, and this is what it looks like here. We are in the introduction tonight, obviously, but if you're thinking about the way this class will go, basically the first half of the class will deal with more general ideas, big picture themes to be found in the book of Proverbs. Then in the second half of the class, we'll get into more specific wisdom about the very specific things that we deal with in our life, family, the way we interact with other people, our work, enjoying life, things of that nature. Okay, so that's the schedule. So let's talk about what we hope to accomplish for this first lesson. We want to talk some just about where Proverbs is, where it fits into the revelation, that is, what has been revealed, what has been told to us by God in what we call the Old Testament. And what does Proverbs bring to the conversation that is unique than maybe other books of the Bible or books of the Old Testament in particular. So we want to talk about that first, and then we'll give an overview of what's in the book of Proverbs and understand the material and even the differences between some of the material that is found in the book of Proverbs. And then we will try to read all of chapter 1 by the end of class and use that to introduce some themes. And then I hope chapter 1 will also be the starting place for some discussions when the video has concluded. But that's what we hope to accomplish here in lesson 1. And we start with an interesting look here at 3 different passages. All 3 of these passages are found in the Old Testament, and they are similar in the fact that each of these 3 passages talks about the sin of adultery and makes clear that adultery is to be avoided. Okay, so notice then with that commonality how these 3 passages may be different in the way that they are communicating that point. All right, Exodus 20:14. You're familiar with this. This is one of the 10 commandments. You shall not commit adultery. This is typical of the way that the law, specifically in books like Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, communicates God's will. God has said, you shall not commit adultery. All right, then we go to a passage like in Jeremiah, for instance, chapter 5, verses 7 to 9. Why should I forgive you? God says, your children have forsaken me and sworn by gods that are not gods. I supplied all their needs, yet they committed adultery and thronged to the houses of prostitutes. They are well-fed, lusty stallions, each neighing after his neighbor's wife. Should I not punish them for this, declare the Lord? Should I not avenge myself on a nation as this? You see, there is a difference to some degree in the way that God, in the book of Jeremiah, is holding the people accountable for the sin of adultery. It's just not right. There is something inherent about adultery itself that is unjust and demands punishment. Okay? Yes, because God had commanded against it, but I think you see in Jeremiah 5, it's something more than simply that God said not to do it in an arbitrary way. There is something deeply wrong, unjust about the sin of adultery, and God says, should I not punish them for this sin? And then, finally, in the book of Proverbs, notice how it, as a wisdom book, will phrase this. It says, but a man who commits adultery has no sense. Whoever does so destroys himself. You see that this is even a little bit more different, in a different way than Jeremiah. The language of Proverbs is such that it says, committing adultery is just foolish. And it is nonsensical, okay, literally. And it has a terrible consequence. That tells us something about the way that Proverbs is trying to communicate. And we see in these three different examples that God does communicate to us, to his people, even here just in the Old Testament, communicates the same idea in different ways. And each of these has its own certain kind of appeal or its own type of divine purpose to it. I was thinking about this, and I wonder if we can relate to this in the way that we talk to our kids, or the way that we remember our parents, or our parents still do talk to us. That sometimes there is a communication to your child of, I said not to do this, so don't do it. Okay, it's kind of plain and simple, and it's based on the authority of the one that is saying it. But at times you may appeal to your children and say, it's just not right what you're doing. It's not fair. It's not just. You're appealing more to the character of the act itself and its inherent value or lack thereof. And then sometimes in the mode of Proverbs, maybe in the most practical sense, we might tell our children or show them, look, you do this, this is the consequence. It's just not going to work out well for you. I think what we're trying to say is that God does all of these things. God, in his perfect wisdom, has in all of these ways communicated his will to us in the pages of the Old Testament, not even to mention the New Testament. That he has given us commands based on his authority and expects us to obey his commands because he has told us. That he has revealed to us, he has shown to us in his word and in what we know to be true in a natural law, that there are things that are right, there are things that are wrong inherently, and we know that, and he urges us to live by what is right and what is just. And he also, in his wisdom, in books like the book of Proverbs, communicates to us, here is the consequence for your actions, whether positive or negative. And so that's how Proverbs kind of fits into the other books of the Old Testament. And these three categories, by the way, are maybe alluded to in a couple passages that you have on your handout as well. Notice in Jeremiah 18, they said, come, let us make plans against Jeremiah. We're familiar now from our study of the book. The people were against Jeremiah and scheming against him. It says, come, let us make plans against Jeremiah, for the teaching of the law by the priest will not cease, nor the counsel from the wise, nor the word from the prophet. So, come, let us attack him with our tongues and pay no attention to anything he says. Notice that there is identified here three different types of teaching or words that are coming to the people from different sources. There's the teaching of the law, there's the counsel of the wise, and there is the word from the prophets. And that maybe refers to the categories we've just mentioned. And then again in Ezekiel 7, verse 26, calamity upon calamity will come, rumor upon rumor. They will go searching for a vision from the prophet. Priestly instruction in the law will cease, and counsel of the elders will come to an end. Notice, by the way, that in each of these passages, the greater context is the rejection of God's people, of each of these sources of revelation. That puts a little bit more of a sober tone on what we're talking about. That God has in each of these ways appealed to his people, and yet in each of these ways the people have refused to listen. Nothing has sticked, nothing has stuck, and they have rejected the vision from the prophet, the messages, the oracles of the prophets. They have rejected the instruction of the law from the priest, and they have even rejected the counsel of those wise men trying to pass on that practical wisdom to the younger generation. So God, in his various ways, communicates his will, and this was a chart that is from a book by Irving Jensen, and it kind of succinctly, easy for me to say, points out the differences between the prophet, the priest, and the philosopher. He says he likes his alliterations, and you know that I do as well. But notice that the prophet says that righteousness is just, and that sin is disobedient. It is a violation of the covenant, as we talked about the prophets being covenant enforcers. The priests talk about what is commanded by God, as well as what is holy, what is unclean, defiled before God. Sin is that. And then the philosopher talks about what is wise, what is prudent, and what is foolish, or folly is the word that is used over and over again in the book of Proverbs. Okay, I think we have harped on that quite a bit and enough. So let's go on to talking about Proverbs in the collection of books that we call the wisdom literature. And by that we refer to mainly Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. Although I might suggest that Song of Solomon would also be included in the wisdom literature, but Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job do seem to fit together in a way that Song of Solomon may not quite fit into. But Proverbs is a book about wise living, and it's as we will see, it's a book that is talking about the way that you ought to live your life so that it will work out well for you, living well in the world. And because of that, there is a certain clarity to Proverbs. There is a certain simplicity, you might even say, to Proverbs. But the reality of the matter is, and this is one of those things that we probably always think about when we read a book like Proverbs as our objection to the way that Proverbs is describing things. But we know that life is not perfect. Everything does not work the way it's supposed to. There is not only imperfection, but there is a finiteness. There is there's limitation to what can be accomplished. And there's always the element of chance and bad luck, we might say, as well as disappointment, even to those who are doing the right thing. Okay, so Ecclesiastes then comes along and joins the conversation of the wisdom literature and talks about the emptiness of life, or we might say even the characteristic of life that makes it difficult to understand. That's the hevel that is in Ecclesiastes, the grasping after wind, the word that's translated vanity. But the conclusion of Ecclesiastes is that in all of this haziness, the best thing you can do is serve God, fear God, and keep his commandments. But on the other side of the conversation from Proverbs and Ecclesiastes is the reality, not just that things are confusing, but that life can be tragic and calamitous, that there is grief and sorrow unimaginable and injustice beyond what we might think possible. And so Job comes along in the conversation and talks about that idea of senselessness, perhaps. All of Job's friends, they have their explanation for the way things are supposed to work, but it becomes very clear very quickly in the book of Job that those explanations just do not hold water. And so the conclusion of the book is that God's wisdom is so far beyond man's wisdom, and all man can do is trust in him. And to that point, all three of these books really center on and are anchored in this concept of the fear of the Lord that we will spend more time in our Proverbs class later on talking about. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline, chapter 1, verse 7. As we already alluded to, the conclusion of the book of Ecclesiastes is fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. And even in Job, in chapter 28, when Job, maybe the author is thinking through and mulling over where wisdom comes from, what wisdom is, where it can be found on the earth, because in the book of Job it seems like it's so unattainable as people are struggling and failing to explain or make sense of the world. Where does wisdom come from? God understands the way to it. He alone knows where it dwells. And he, that is God, said to man, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to shun evil is understanding. By the way, you'll remember that Job's, I forget the word. There's some fancy word for it. But the short statement that characterizes Job in the opening scene is that he was a man who feared God and turned away from evil. And chapter 28 of Job tells us that is wisdom. That's what it means to live well. So there is a unity in the wisdom literature, that all three of these books are really coming back to the same point, which is wisdom means to fear God and to keep his commandments, to turn away from evil. But they each do that in their own way, or by addressing a different aspect of our life. Proverbs, with the very clear pathway for how to live well. Ecclesiastes, with the difficulty of navigating life when it is confusing. And Job, when we are met with unjust and terrible calamity. Another way to visualize this has been put together by the Bible Project. And I used this actually a few years ago when we did a class on the wisdom literature. And so I will not belabor the point, but just encourage you to go to either BibleProject.com or go to YouTube and search the Bible Project. Look for their wisdom series and watch these very helpful, I think, videos on these three books, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. But basically, to sum up, Proverbs they describe as the young woman who is a teacher and is very smart about pointing out exactly, in each situation, the perfect advice. But Ecclesiastes, maybe we would imagine the critic, the sharp, middle-aged man who is pointing out how things aren't quite exactly as they seem, maybe bordering on cynicism. And then in Job, we have the wise old man who has been through everything, and on the other side has a perspective about man's limitations and what it is that man must do in the midst of such tragedy. But go and watch these videos, and you will benefit from their description of these three books. Okay, let's talk then about the organization of Proverbs, the structure of these books, or this book, the book of Proverbs. Okay, in the most simple way, not the most simple, but in a very simple way, there are three basic sections to Proverbs. There is the opening section in chapters 1 to 9 that serve as a prologue that introduce the main themes of the book of Proverbs. Then there is the most famous part of Proverbs, chapters 10 all the way to chapter 30, which as you read them, they are saying after saying that are largely not connected to each other, but are sayings that give specific tidbits of wisdom on this topic or another. And then there is an epilogue of sorts that mirrors the front end with an address from a mother to a son, and some concluding points about living well. Okay, we get a little bit more specific, use the same basic breakdown of three sections, but look at more detailed differences in these sections. We do have the father's advice on wisdom to his son in the first 9 chapters, and then in these sayings there are some differences. So from 10 to 22, we have these Proverbs. Again, they're just one verse apiece for the most part, and they may be framed differently. We'll talk about this maybe more next week. But some of the Proverbs, there seems to be a higher concentration of these in 10 to 15, talk about a contrast, that a wise person does this, but a foolish person does this. There are also kinds of Proverbs that we find maybe more concentrated in 16 to 22, that talk about, this is true, and furthermore, this other thing is true as well. But basically, 10 to 22, we have these miscellaneous Proverbs. Then, starting in 22:17, we're introduced to the words of the wise, and these make up not just individual verses, but larger groups of verses that go through and explain, again, different things pertaining to wisdom. Then there's a collection starting in 25 that was said to be in the text, chapter 25, verse 1, collected by the men of Hezekiah. And then we have the sayings of Agur in chapter 30, the sayings of King Lemuel in chapter 31, and then really it is 31, 10 to 31 that makes up this final acrostic poem, if you remember about that, related to the worthy woman, which could be a continuation of what King Lemuel's mother is saying to him, or it could be its own conclusion that is tacked on the end of the book of Proverbs. Okay. So in a general sense, we have a prologue, collection of sayings, and an epilogue. But even in the collection of sayings, we see that there is a breakdown, and this just gives you one other look at the way that these sections are characterized. But we'll move on past this and not spend a whole lot more time on it. Let's get into the text. Let's get into Proverbs chapter 1 and end with this. What I want to do is just read Proverbs chapter 1, and I will leave up here on the screen this basic breakdown or outline of the chapter if you want to be following the thoughts of chapter 1 as we go. But of course, I would encourage you to also have your Bible open, and let's read together Proverbs 1. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the naive, to the youth knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. To understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Indeed, they are a graceful wreath to your head and ornaments about your neck. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait for blood, let us ambush the innocent without cause, let us swallow them alive like Sheol, even whole as those who go down to the pit. We will all find kinds of precious wealth. We will fill our houses with spoil. Throw in your lot with us. We shall all have one purse. My son, do not walk in the way with them. Keep your feet from their path. For their feet run to evil, and they hasten to shed blood. Indeed, it is useless to spread the baited net in the sight of any bird, but they lie in wait for their own blood. They ambush their own lives. So are the ways of everyone who gains by violence. It takes away the life of its possessors. Wisdom shouts in the street. She lifts her voice in the square. At the head of the noisy streets she cries out. At the entrance of the gates in the city she utters her sayings. How long, O naive ones, will you love being simple-minded? And scoffers delight themselves in scoffing. And fools hate knowledge. Turn to my reproof. Behold, I will pour out my spirit on you. I will make my words known to you. Because I called you and you refused. I stretched out my hand and no one paid attention. And you neglected all my counsel and did not want my reproof. I will also laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your dread comes. When your dread comes like a storm and your calamity comes like a whirlwind. When distress and anguish come upon you, then they will call on me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they will not find me. Because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. They would not accept my counsel. They spurned all my reproofs. So they will eat of the fruit of their own way and be satiated with their own devices. For the waywardness of the naive will kill them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. But he who listens to me shall dwell securely and will be at ease from the dread of evil. Okay. We'll continue as we go through these first few lessons to talk about some of these main ideas, specifically the fear of the Lord and its connection to wisdom, the foundation of wisdom as is said in 1 verse 7, as well as the various sources of wisdom. One of those is mentioned here that is obviously repeated quite often in Proverbs. The parents of this young man, mother and father, we learn not just from what God has revealed to us, but the fear of the Lord allows us to then learn and be educated and find wisdom in all kinds of sources. And we have one of the main instances, or one of the main topics by which the young man is warned here, which is the association of those who are acting to be working for his benefit and all in it together for common profit, but are really just setting themselves up to be devoured by their own wickedness. And then we have the personification of wisdom of the woman who calls out to those who are foolish and simple-minded and invites them to come, but is often rejected by those who want to continue in their folly. So Proverbs 1 lays all of that out, and again, we'll continue to talk about these things as we go forward. But let's just end with this, the point of view of Proverbs, and then I'll give you some things that you can discuss as we conclude. As we have already alluded to, and we will see, Proverbs deals with very ordinary earthly topics. Some instructions that are very simple about waking up early, and about saving your money, and about speaking in a calm voice to those that you disagree with. Okay? These are very everyday types of things. But all of these then are in the context of a relationship with God. The point is in Proverbs that as someone who fears the Lord and is connected, is loyal to Him, then everyday ordinary activities then find their meaning and find their context in that relationship that I have with Jehovah God. That's the perspective of Proverbs. Proverbs also says that gaining wisdom requires diligence and effort and hard work. You got to really put in the work to become the kind of wise person that Proverbs is describing. And yet, as we've already seen in chapter 1, wisdom is offering herself, her benefits to anybody who will pass by. It is obvious, it is visible how she is making herself available to anybody who will listen. That also is included in the point of view of Proverbs. There are these instructions for daily living, these momentary decisions that have to be made and how to make those decisions, and yet Proverbs also describes a continuous way, a ongoing, progressive, day after day, week after week, month after month, lifelong endeavor of walking in wisdom. And the last thing that I'll say, and maybe we'll have more opportunity to talk about this, is that Proverbs is not simply about the individual, but it places the individual in a greater community, a family, a society, a nation even, that also ought to be designed by wisdom. And maybe Proverbs is even assuming that the society, the community around a person will encourage the wisdom that it is encouraging. And also, though, it will have pieces of wisdom that should be accepted not just by individuals, but by whole communities as well. This is what we're getting into when we get into a study of the book of Proverbs, and I think there'll be much enriching to take from this. So as we conclude, I would say for further thought, especially after the reading of chapter 1, and for discussion, if there are those that you can or would like to discuss with, three things. One, think about Proverbs being that voice of counsel. It's maybe has a unique voice from the voice of the law, or the voice of the prophet. What role in our lives do wise counselors play? Those who give us that kind of wise advice that we need to hear. Who are those people and what role have they played or do they play in our lives? Or discuss this. This appeal in Proverbs 1, this wicked appeal of join us, come with us, and we'll all have common profit. This appeal of the wicked companion. How would we see that? Does that still exist? Is that still a temptation for people today? And how might Proverbs 1 look in the 21st century? And what should we be on guard for? And then finally, we read about that beautiful call of wisdom in the second half of chapter 1 of Proverbs, but yet it was rejected by many. So why do we do that? Why do we reject the beautiful call of wisdom that seems to be so plain, so clear, so obvious, and so appealing? Why do we reject wisdom's call? So that is the end then of our first class on Proverbs, and we look forward to doing this again every Wednesday night at 7:30. These videos will premiere, and then they will stay up on the YouTube channel, and I encourage you to share them with others if you think that that might be helpful. But that's it for tonight, and we thank you for joining us.